Hi, yes, hello everyone. I'm Gavin.js, and oh my goodness, let's talk about perfectionism. So, I've been aware for some time that I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but that really came out with this project because I had initially wanted to make something small, something that wouldn't take a lot of time, so that I could test out some of the new equipment that I got recently and a new workflow that I was hoping would really make it so that I could work more flexibly, be able to work where I wanted to and when I wanted to without having to spend my entire day sat in front of my desktop, which isn't bad. It's just in the middle of winter, it's not really the best for my mental or physical health to sit all day indoors. When you start and end your day in the dark, it's a little demoralizing, and so my fiance recently bought me a drawing tablet so that I could get out of the office a little bit and be able to work outdoors or even just in the other room so that I can experience a little bit more daylight than I normally would in the winter if I were to just sit at my desk. So I wanted to draw something on my tablet, and I wanted to draw something small to really just test it out. And so I had thought, why not draw a salmon? Now, I have my reasons for drawing a salmon. I know that that sounds a little bit random and maybe not like anything anybody else would expect from me, but like I said, I have my reasons. And so I started drawing this salmon, and I had very specific reasons for picking the species of salmon and picking the spawning over the oceanic form, if that's even what it's called. And so this attention to detail, if you can't tell already, really started to lean into the perfectionism. And I hadn't even realized it at the time. But looking back, it's just so much more effort than I think was really necessary. And that was just a little bit of foreshadowing for how tedious this project was going to turn out. So, as I started drawing on my tablet, I started experimenting with different apps because I had never really tried to do specifically vector art on a drawing tablet before. And a lot of what I had seen on YouTube of other creators using iPads or Android tablets or whatever else on a drawing tablet specifically, everybody had always done raster images, which is the sort of thing that you can do in Photoshop. And that's a very different workflow from what I generally have. I really enjoy working in vector art, as you have seen in my previous videos. I work a lot in Illustrator, and I really enjoy vector art because instead of working on layers and modifying the values of pixels, you still work in layers, but every object is sort of its own layer. Every object that you draw is infinitely editable. You can go back in and change where different lines start and end. You can change the curve, you can adjust the color, you can adjust everything without deleting anything. It's a very non-destructive workflow and an infinitely editable workflow, which really it really leans into my perfectionism because it's so hard to say when a piece is done. It's very hard because you can always go in and edit. And of course, you can go in and edit in Photoshop indefinitely as well. It's just, I find it a lot harder to practice non destructive work in Photoshop because it's not really set up for that. And Illustrator is very much set up to almost innately have a non destructive workflow. Anyway, I tried to find some apps that have a lot of the same features as Illustrator, and so I was able to find a combination that worked well for what I was attempting to do. The only thing that I really couldn't do on these apps was the amount of gradient work that I like to do. I like to go in and use a lot of different gradients in a lot of very creative ways that weren't really supported by these apps. And so I was able to use another app called Parsec to be able to remote into my desktop and still use Illustrator on my drawing tablet, which was really nice. And it may have negated some of the work in finding some of these apps to work with, but the scale of the user interface didn't really work on the tablet. It was very much built for a large monitor. I had some trouble with that. So, while it's definitely possible for me to work exclusively in Illustrator on my tablet, it's not the most ideal. I'd only really try and do that when I don't have access to my desktop and I'm trying to do something that simply doesn't work in those other apps on my tablet. So I did a little bit of back and forth, and I also used a raster drawing app just to get a little bit more organic detail on the salmon than would normally be possible in these vector apps. So I used that in combination with the image trace in Illustrator just so that I could get something that looked a little bit nicer. It's largely just these spots on this salmon because I really wanted something that had a little bit more painterly of a feel to it. I wanted something that wasn't just a brush stroke, it was more of an organic blob, and so I was able to get that by using image trace, and I think it worked out really well. So once I got this all drawn up using those apps and using Illustrator, I did end up eventually coming back to my desktop just because it's the easiest thing to do to edit in Illustrator, and I was thinking I would be able to turn this very flat salmon. As you can see, I've drawn it just a side view. It's very flat, there's nothing dynamic, it's not exactly posed, and there's no good composition here. So I really wanted to go in and create a brush out of this salmon that I had drawn so that then I could apply that brush to a curve and sort of fake some 3D. I thought that would be really cool, and I'd be able to do that with a combination of different layer masks, and I had this whole process in my head worked out, but then I realized that some of the gradient work that I had done, specifically in Illustrator, it didn't allow for this image to become a brush, which is very unfortunate, but it sort of makes sense because I had kind of cheated by blurring some of these curves so that they look like they're a gradient when it's really not. It's just a blurred raster effect, and that raster effect can't be put on a brush, which I didn't know, but it makes sense, and I had used this technique before to get a very complex shape and then warp it accordingly, but I had never tried it with these effects, so that left me with sort of two options. I could either redraw the whole thing so that then I get the pose and the composition that I want, or I could model this salmon in Blender, a software that I've only seldom used. I am not trained in Blender, so I'm a little hesitant, but then I'd be able to go in and pose it in 3D and get the composition that I want without having to redraw everything. So naturally, I went with that because the sunk cost fallacy had really sunk in, and secretly, this was my plan the whole time. You see, I have this other project that I'm sort of simultaneously working on, where I will want a 3D modeled fish, and I was hoping to use this flat image that I've drawn here as the texture for that 3D model. I just didn't anticipate using that for this, again, quote, small project. I was really hoping to just be able to make a 2D image of this salmon and pose it afterwards in 2D, but I figured why not go ahead and just 3D model it and go ahead, learn some Blender along the way, and I'll have just another section of this other project going on. And what could this other project possibly be? I guess you're just gonna have to subscribe to find out. And while you're at it, you might as well leave a comment predicting what you think this could be. And not that this is much of a hint, but before that big project comes out, you'll definitely see more sea creatures, so I don't think that's much of a hint, but maybe that'll help you figure it out. I don't know. So this has been a lot of 2D work to create this texture, which wasn't initially supposed to become a texture yet. So I guess I'll be finishing up in Blender, and I'll have another video coming out soon detailing that. I'll be learning Blender a little bit on the fly. I do have a decent amount of 3D experience, but I have very little Blender experience, so bear with me as we figure out yet another new workflow. But that's all for this one. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, bye.